Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. Now, in the early days of my channel, and indeed in the early days of HEMA, a lot of electronic ink was devoted to arguing over edge versus flat parrying. Now, as I say, in the early days of my channel, I actually devoted a series of videos to this topic. However, because I have something, I'll just grab with the other hand, I have something now which I didn't have when I was doing those before. I'm going to talk about one very specific thing, and one reason why when we look at swords, and I'm going to talk a little bit about complex hilted swords as well, when we look at hilt design, that actually tells us something about how those swords are used, but particularly in defensive terms. So in the early days of edge versus flat arguments on the internet, and we have to point out that most of these stemmed from an organisation called the ARMA, the Association for Renaissance Martial Arts. A lot of that group were very much had one of their main things was that you should never use the edge for defensive actions. Now, HEMA moved on, our translations of sources, our understanding of sources moved on, and we now know that that's BS. Okay, it's absolutely confirmed that edges were used with medieval weapons in all sorts of different ways, and that boiling down the topic of defending with your edge or your flat is a BS argument, because sometimes you do things with your edge, sometimes you do it obliquely, neither with really the edge or the flat. Sometimes you strike into an incoming strike, sometimes you just block it. There's just so many different ways of encountering another blade that fixating on this edge versus flat topic is just complete waste of time, basically. But fundamentally, if we take a treatise like Fiore de Liberis Fior di Battaglia, or if we look at Vardi or Marozzo or any of the Bolognese sources, we can specifically see that the edge is used in defensive actions. And in fact, in the Bolognese sources, they often tell you which edge to use. Sometimes you use the front edge, sometimes you use the back edge, and indeed sometimes the flat is sort of used. But why am I talking about this topic now? Well, quite simply, as I mentioned, I now have a Langmesser. Okay, now you will notice on the side of the Langmesser is the nail or nagel, and that protects the outside of the hand in certain binding actions. Now, what's interesting, if I just put the long sword down for a second, is that in the Messer treatises, we are often told specifically to do certain actions with the flat of the blade. And of course, having the nail there means that you can do that, and the blade, if it slides down, will stop on that. So see here, we've got a quillon, another quillon, collectively known as a crossguard, and essentially it's like you've got a third quillon sticking out at the side. Sometimes this can be straight, sometimes it can even curve upwards, usually it curves downwards, and sometimes it takes the form of a shell. And indeed, in later periods, we start to see an outer ring guard on certain types of side sword, and even some end of the 15th and beginning of the 16th century longswords as well. So the fact that we, in the treatises, we specifically for this weapon are told to do certain things with the flat, it makes an awful lot of sense that therefore to make that work, so we don't get our knuckles chopped off by a blade sliding down and taking the ends of the fingers off, we have specifically an adaptation on the hilt to enable that, to make that safe and make that possible. If I put the Langmesser down, you will notice that in the same period, in the 15th century, longswords do not have that. Okay, they are devoid of that side protection. Indeed, by the end of the 15th century and into the 16th century, we do get longswords which have side rings and things like this. But predominantly, you will notice that whereas the Langmesser right the way through the 15th century had that side nail sticking out, the longsword does not have that. So if I were to make a defensive action purely with the flat of the blade, and the other person's blade slid down here, there is nothing to stop that blade from coming down and either taking the thumb off on that side or the knuckles off on that side. The crossguard, there goes the ceiling, the crossguard is there for a very specific set of reasons, and you will notice that the crossguard points in the same direction as the edges of the blade. Ergo, most of the actions that you do with the longsword that encounter another person's blade are done with the edge, and that is why the defensive thing that's there to protect your hand, the quillon, points in the same direction as the edge. Now, just briefly, we can also look at later periods of swords and look at their hilt designs, and we can infer certain things about how those swords were held and used. If we take this example here of a certain type of spadroon, you will notice that it has a double shell hilt that protects the front. If I now angle the sword like that and I hold it, for example, if we look at backsword and broadsword treatises, often the sword is held like this with the knuckle bow or the front of the hand forward. You'll notice that this style of sword doesn't have much, apart from a knuckle bow, it doesn't have much to protect the front of the hand. It has nothing to protect the sides of the hand. Well, it should be no surprise that this type of sword was predominantly held point forward. And being held point forward, you can see why that style of guard, which is protecting the front of the hand, protects the hand in the position that I normally would encounter an opponent's blade in. Normally I'm going to be encountering an opponent's blade at these sorts of angles, and that style of hilt protects the hand in those blade engagements. If I just grab another sword, so here we have a basket hilt, a Highland style basket hilt, you will notice if I hold that point on, it doesn't have very much to protect the hands, because surprise, surprise, whilst these can be held point on line, predominantly basket hilted swords of this British style, and famously Scottish but also English and Irish style as well, isn't designed primarily to be held point forward like a rapier or a small sword or a spadroon would be. And it doesn't therefore provide great protection to points from that angle. However, this style of sword is, generally speaking, used as a cutting sword against other cutting swords and held in guards whereby the blade is more upwards, sometimes lower, sometimes point higher, it depends on the system you're following, but it provides a huge amount of protection from cuts to the front and to the sides. So the style of the hilt tells you an awful lot about the general expectations of how your weapon and how your hand is going to encounter other weapons within the context of this weapon. Okay, so a cup hilt rapier with long quillons, famously used in Spain, works brilliantly with a certain style of Spanish rapier fencing, which is held with the arm outstretched, the point straight forward, and with the cup protecting the front of your hand. Hilts tell you an awful lot about how the sword is used. So, going back to the Langmesser and the longsword, and coming back to this edge versus flat thing, it is part of the same topic. It's a very big topic and very complex topic, and clearly I'm just skirting over it for the purposes of this video. But really, now that I have a Langmesser, I just want to point out that they are famous for having this nagel, not sure how to pronounce it, but the nail projecting at the side, and this enables or facilitates and makes more practical certain techniques with the flat of the blade, and we do not see that on long swords or arming swords because they were not used completely differently. We do see similar techniques, and absolutely anybody out there studying Lichtenauer based sources will say, but there are techniques in the Langmesser which are mirrored in the longsword. Absolutely true, but by and large the quillons or the crossguard points in the direction of the edges for a very good reason, and that's because predominantly it's the edges that encounter the other person's blade most of the time and are there to protect your hand from their blades sliding downwards. If you were doing lots of actions with the flat of the blade, we would have expected projecting things, be it side rings or even expanded rain guard as they're sometimes known, or chape, or the nagel that we have on the Langmesser. We would expect those to have appeared on the longsword at the same time or earlier than they appear on the Langmesser. Hope that's been somewhat useful, and this is a massive topic and this is only my skirting over of it, but really just to remind you that that thing exists on the side of the Langmesser hilt for the very reason that connects to this topic of us talking about edge and flat and encountering another person's blade. Final thing I want to say before I leave is that not all systems are the same, and whilst longswords across Europe shared certain characteristics, and in fact a lot of them were made in a few central manufacturing centres, for example Milan, and exported out from there, don't think that they were all necessarily used the same way. And this is also true if we're talking about Japanese swords. So some people out there on the internet who consider themselves experts on katanas, for example, will say, oh, you never parry with the edge of a katana. Well, if you look at different schools of kenjutsu, you will see that different ryu, or schools, actually use their katanas in somewhat different ways. There is not only one way to use a katana, there is not only one way to use a longsword, and there is not only one way to use a mesa or dusak. There were different systems, different schools of thought. There were perhaps regional differences, in fact there were regional differences, but there were also individual school and individual master and individual practitioner differences as well. There are many ways to skin a cat, and with one weapon there isn't one perfect way of using it. There are many ways you can use it, and so making any sort of categorical statements about edge and flat or any other topic about you must never do this with this sword or this type of sword was only used in this way, whenever you hear someone saying that, your BS alarm the siren goes off and the light starts flashing, okay? Because you have to be far more pragmatic about that and realise, looking at the historical sources, that you can see that one treatise or one system's way of using, let's say, a side sword in 1550 might be completely different to another system's way of using basically the same weapon at the same date, possibly even in the same city and possibly in another part of Europe. So often many different ways of doing things, and you can't make categorical statements about what is wrong and right, especially in a period when, relatively speaking, we have quite a small corpus of source material to draw upon. Anyway, I hope that's been useful and interesting. I'll see everyone soon for another video. And yeah, click like if you didn't think that this video was awful. Subscribe please if you haven't done, and I'll see you again really soon for another video. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!